The August 22nd, 2024 meeting of the Richmond Sanitary District Board of Commissioners is called to order. The only item of business on the agenda today is the workshop/discussion of the 2025 budget. I guess with that being said, I'll just turn it over to our director, Pat.
Okay, unless one of these others want to volunteer, I guess I will go ahead and start. I will start this year with 6601. The tax fund, as you all know, this one is in the city council's ordinance that will go to budget when we do our resolutions. This one is not included in them, but I will start with that one because we still, as a board, obviously approve all these invoices. We approve bids and everything through this, but it is included in the overall city's budget being tax dollars. So there's a few different things. I want to start out with 6601 this year. First, Mayor Oler is making changes to code enforcement, and he is basically pulling them out of this fund. Those details are not yet worked out. Currently, he has them placed in a different account number altogether as far as salaries go, but there is a salary interlocal that has been standing for several years where the sanitary district pays percentages back to different positions at the city. Those have now been lumped into that. I drafted an updated interlocal for the salary. It has not yet been approved. I still think they're messing with a few other pieces related to that. So we will be paying some of that salary, and it's not quite reflected in this budget yet. So as we go through it, it'll look like we have a $600,000 surplus, but really when I talk through that, we'll see that some of this is hedging on how that's going to land, and then there's some other pieces that we'll get into that. But it is a big piece. As you all know, when that got placed in our budget, it was roughly $888,000. So these changes are big. In some ways, we'll still be paying to some degree that in a different fund through intergovernmentals. But I don't believe it'll be all that, so there is some relief to this budget, or to this fund of our budget through those efforts. With that being said, I will dive in then. As far as revenue goes for 6601, these are tax-based dollars. There was a 4%, the controller spoke about this in our opening statements at Committee of the Whole on Tuesday, and there was a 4% growth quotient to this, but obviously circuit breaker is a piece that goes up on us. So these values were done by the controller based upon what the state had sent her on expected circuit breaker loss, as well as the growth quotient to these tax dollars. Overall, there is an increase, but it's based upon those factors. With that, I will go into personnel services, our personal services. Overall, there is a 2.66% increase to these lines. That the mayor's office and controller have set that there will be a 4% increase for civilians in the 2025 year, and then the AFSCME bargaining unit is on their third and final year of their agreed contract, so their percentage goes up with that. If you remember, theirs was not an across-the-board percentage. It was done on the Baker-Tilly wage study that the city conducted, and it was agreed upon that they would all move a third of the way from where their existing salary was towards the identified market value of their job title. So they all move at different percentages based upon how close or how far away their salary was 3 years ago to where that market value was identified at. So that's why it's not a kind of a flat percentage here, or easy to give you a flat percentage on what AFSCME moved at. Next, I will move on to the supplies sections, unless there are specific questions about the personal services. I won't get too far into that. I do know the controller and Sherry Hemingway payrolls believe that the insurance is going to be only a 0.5% increase. I think some of that was the quotes they got originally for the 2024 budget. They were expecting, I think it was an 8%, and it turned out to be less than that. So there was a bigger buffer in the 2024 year than they actually needed. So there was some savings in that, so the increase needed for 25 is much smaller for those
Yeah,
reasons.
it almost looked to me like there was no change, but you're saying because last year's end up under,
Yeah.
we can budget about the same for this year.
Yeah, it's really, really low. So then I'll move on to supplies. Overall, in the 0505, as you know, 6601 is divided into two sub-departments, 0505, which is really the administration side, and 0506, which is the operation side, which is mostly the trash and recycling fleet. But in the supplies section, overall, there is a 0.04% increase. So of that 614,000 dollars that are allocated for the year, there's only about a $250 increase in that whole section. I can talk about a few notes of things that did move up or down, but overall, of the 2000s, it's 0.04% difference. So what we have in the 6601, 0505, 2410 account, general supplies, there is a $2,000 increase. As part of the labor management meetings with the AFSCME bargaining unit, both Parks and Street had always given 5 work shirts to their staff. In 2020, the district came around and did that as well. I had kind of scrounged money off of a little bit of the top of multiple funds for years, and this year I just allocated a specific slot for that. So as some things you'll see moving down, it kind of scraped off the top and put it as its own allocated note. So that is that $2,000 in this account. There's an increase in the account directly below that, the 2210, which is the vehicle operation and maintenance. That line is actually for fuel, and that is based on where we were tracking on spending fuel this year. That looks like one that it should have been bumped up slightly, so that was increased as well. If we go down a few accounts to concrete, which is the 6601, 0506, 2330, this is an account that was reduced $2,500. There's an asphalt account too below that. That asphalt is what we give to street department as materials, and we give them a list of alleys that our trash trucks go down that need repair, and they will take that $25,000 as far as they go. Sometimes they'll use some of the concrete and the original $5,000, and some of that we use, but we historically haven't been using all the concrete in the way it goes. So we did reduce that $2,500 going into 2025. And that's really the significant changes in the supplies, but again, overall, it was only a 0.04% difference in that. And with inflation, I felt like we did a really good job of holding those lines. Into our 3,000 accounts, our other services and charges, there is a 5.2% increase, which really comes out to about $172,000 increase in this budget. I'll talk about some significant ones here, but the overall difference is we have planned approximately 200 and some thousand, 220,000 or so in our capital every year for replacement of commercial trash trucks. Mm-hmm. And this is a case where we found where through Sourcewell, we think we can get over a 3% savings by leasing 3 trucks. So really this 172,000 is actually reflecting of us reducing 200 in the capital for a single trash truck. And we are moving it into a lease where we will look to buy the three remaining commercial trucks. So really this in the entire difference is really just moving that capital into these services here. But I will go through a few of these noteworthy items as I go down. The first one will be 6601, 0505, 301, 3120, I believe, professional services. There is an increase of $40,000 in this account. That's really for where we pay our ACH payment with our credit cards. We've always paid that. We typically split this cost 50-50 in 6201 and in 6601. Last year, for some reason, we did not catch it. We actually split it 66%, 33%, and we actually had it in 2 different accounts in 6201. I think that's where we got thrown off. as we were tracking that. So really, we just brought it back to a 50-50 split. So when we get to 6201, you'll actually see a reduction in 6201 that matches this increase. So it's just really an accounting movement, not an actual increase to the overall sanitary district budget. The next notable difference, there is some in workers' compensation premiums. You'll see, and that falls when HR gave their discussion at Committee of the Whole. That's just tracking what they believe that contractual cost will be just from claims they've seen. So I think it was a 15% is what they were seeing on their piece overall. Moving down the line, lease payment, 6601, 0505, 312, 3815. We just discussed this. That's, and you see a $229,810 increase, and that is that lease payment changing from capital. The next significant one is a few down. It is in the transfer of funds, 6601, 0505, 312, 3974. There's a reduction of $154,000 in that. This is strictly a reduction in what we are putting back in our capital improvement funds. It's just a change of that. The reason I did not put as much back is not because I don't think we need it. It was the goal of the administration this year is to have a fully balanced budget. And that goal was succeeded at Committee of the Whole. It is a fully balanced budget, but because of so much movement with code enforcement here, I played it extra conservative. And again, I'm talking about that 600,000 surplus. I don't know how that completely falls out. If it became a true surplus, I would want to put it back in the capital improvement funds and or just leave it as an excess in our cash balance for now and put it in like next year, like going in 26. But it's not that we don't have assets that need to be having funds put back for. It was just in an attempt to balance a budget with lots of moving parts that are still kind of moving. I kind of left that off. So that is a reduction there of $154,000. That is really it. I mean, you can go to the GIS, which is the line right below that. That's just because we tucked it into an incorrect spot the year before. We tucked it into the line below it on an error, just a graphical line. So you'll see where that one changed. So we just moved it to the correct account. It's not an actual increase in the budget. It just looks like an increase in that line. The only other, I lied, there's one more significant one. It's in the transfer of funds in the 0506. So it's 6601, 0506, 312, 3974. This is the value that the trash department, trash collection pays to the landfill for the trash that they take there. We've just seen a historical slow trend up. So we're using that percentage of the trend. So it increases from 920,000 to 940,000 is what we believe. What we believe that volume of trash will be at that rate. So after that, I will move on to the capital. Overall, there is a 42% decrease in capital, which equates to about $600,000. There's a few pieces going on here. The commercial trucks, which we talked about, came off. So that's 200,000 of this 600. We also, in the 6601, 0505, 502, 4321, this is a line that we usually use that we split sewer projects and like sewer lining with. In a discussion with the mayor, as we weren't sure how this tax fund was going to go, we pulled this to 100% to 6201 for this year. I've discussed with him that I do not believe it's sustainable long-term. But in the case here where we're looking at variables, we were agreeance to do this. And we did get, and Elijah could speak more to this probably, I can't remember all of it, but we had some SRF funding still available to us that we rolled some mining stuff into. So we kind of bought that down anyway in another method, but still rolled it 100% into 6201, at least for 2025. As of right now. Now, again, if this surplus or this seeming surplus of money after the variable shakeout has some excess, it would either go to the capital improvement fund or we could split that back out towards that 50-50. So those two things primarily drive the cost down. Now, there is the capital improvement facilities account 6601, 0505, 503, 4310. It went down, but it's strictly project-based. We had a couple things we were doing with the MRF this year, taking some water out of that storage facility and things like that. So some specific projects we had for this year that we do not have for next year. So that is why there's a reduction there. And that is all I have overall for 6601, unless there are additional questions. Like I said, I know it's a big question still on those the intergovernmental line, which is in the 3,000 accounts. I fully expect to go up to pay for, one, that update in that salary interlocal. It was set in 2016, so all the salaries we pay back have obviously increased at the city from 2016 to 2025, as well as code enforcement being rolled back into that, and a portion of that will go up. So I'm estimating anywhere from $100,000 to $180,000 would be the increase to that intergovernmental line too. So if you think about that 600,000, you add 180 to that, and you factor in what we took out in the sewer and what we didn't put in the improvement funds, that really close to choose that 600 back up. Still balanced when we do it, and I think that's what we've left back. But until all that got hammered out, we did not want to commit those dollars. If there are no questions, I will move to 6607, which is the Tax Funds Capital Improvement Fund. This fund does not have a significant, obviously amount of lines. It's a pretty quick discussion. What we plan to spend next year out of this would be $672,000. We're not putting much in. We're only putting $74,000 in, so that does reduce the funds that are in there. However, I do want to state that of the $672,150, it's really laid out for two projects. The first being $252,000 in the line for landfill cell construction. Is everybody there? I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. I said I would wait, but I just kind of pushed on like everybody had a paper in front of them like I do. You'll see that in 2024, that same $252,000 is there. That is for, it says landfill cell construction. It's for capping cells at the landfill. We kind of wait on the Indiana Department of Environmental Management to give us when that needs to be done. We know we're getting close, so we've kind of tucked it into the budget every year, but that 252 in 2024 will not be spent. So, so really technically you could think of that as reducing that cash piece off. The other line there is the $420,150. That is for the levee project. We've spoke several times on the levee project and its need. We are working on an Okra grant for that would cover I want really close to 50% of the overall project. So we have $420,000 in this account. There's a separate account or a whole separate fund where there's another $420,000. It was split 50-50. So we would be supplying around $800,000, and we're hoping to get from the Okra grant a $700-ish thousand to complete that project. So it's really pending a grant. So one of these is something that's kind of doubled up from last year, and the other one is a pending a grant. So beyond those two things, that's all we anticipate spending out of 6607. If there are no questions, we will move on from the tax fund.
So I did have a question then. Mm-hmm. So what we see down below where it says projected adjustment just means that those two projects that you mentioned above, which weren't done last year, the funds will go forward.
Yes.
Those funds will be available to roll forward to this year.
Correct. Okay. Okay. We can move on. Jess, did I say 6501 would be next? Yep. 6501, which is our stormwater fund. Everybody there? Okay. Personal services. These increased 3.4, overall, 3.4-ish%. Again, we spoke to that. It's the same thing, really going to be the same exact discussion on all the personal services. It's the 4% for civilians. There's no AFSCME in stormwater, but then there's how they've done the health insurance and those pieces that look at that. The next item would be supplies. There is overall a slight reduction of funds here, a 2.48% reduction of a couple $100. So I'm not really going to get in too much into what those are. It's just a few moving pieces. We will look at the other services, the 3,000 accounts, though. There is a 30% reduction, so we will discuss what those items are, go over significance. The first one being 6501, 0502, 301, 3120. Professional services, we have a decrease of $5,000 in that account. We reduced that. We have funds in there for grant consultant, which is what we're using for the Okra grant. So based on what we were looking at, we reduced that note in there. There are several notes, but the note that got reduced was for grant consultant with what we think we're going to need. The next item is contractual services, the very next line. That is gone up 6.8% of $12,500. There are a handful of small notes. One of the ones that we would not have normally seen moving. So, I mean, several things go up naturally in our contracts that we have out, including to legal services and those matters. But one of the pieces we have in here is the new building that we've put in. The first move was to do modifications to make it ADA compliant, and that covered what we had in the budget for this year. There may be some other minor modifications that we need to install in the building, so we put some funds in there temporarily to identify what those may be. There's some increase to property liability. Claims and insurance premiums, again, those are insurance driven based upon HR's committee of the whole. It's just their estimates at this point in time. They don't have that hard out, but based on where we're tracking spending now and where the market is, this is what they expect those percent increases to be in the insurance side. The last item, which is a reduction, another reduction, is the 6501, 0502, 312, 3974. And that is a $345,000 reduction. And that is just like in the other one. That's a reduction of what is going into the capital improvement funds. Just as we looked at that and what we were setting aside, that's what we saw this year. Again, it's in an attempt to balance the budgets, right? I mean, and which we always try to do here. It's not just under this new administration. That was our goal all the time. And we're looking at that, especially as on most of our funds, we have the ability to set rates, and we try to be at cost, and that's what we really look to do that. So in those efforts, we reduced really what was going to those improvement funds. And I think I may have misspoke earlier and said the 3,000s went up. Did I say they went up? I hope I didn't say they went up. It went down 30%. So that covers those. Unless there are questions on the 3,000s. If not, I'll go into the capital.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So we're tracking 462,687 for the first 6 months of 2024 for the transfer out account, the 3974. We're budgeting 450. That's less than half for the first 6 months. Do we anticipate?
So it's not spent linearly. And again, it's designed on those. Let me pull that up. It is laid out for.
Yeah, it's hard to annualize, I guess, is what you're saying.
Yeah, and
because of the way it's, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I can scroll over here and tell you exactly what we.
Is that a bond that changed?
Oh, going to a bond fund instead of
So
capital.
that transfer covers two things. It really covers what goes into the capital improvement funds, and it does cover bond repayment. So the bond repayment comes out pretty regularly. The transfers that go to the improvement fund typically happen at one point in time.
Got it.
So that's where some of these move. And when we look at bond payments on these, the controller, so there's another big bond payment section in 6201. When we get there, the controller kind of pays those as just a blanket percentage, and then she goes through and rectifies them based upon the back end piece. It's just easier up front instead of doing, I don't know how all that works, but we run into that every year. Near the end of the year, we rectify both things. What typically happens is we actually spend slightly more out of 6505, the way the blanket percentage rolls out, than what is actually designated for 6501, and actually money goes back into 6501 that came out of from 6201, which was slightly underspent based on the percentages. So it is hard to just look at this and track it like it's a linear 1/12 per month. It doesn't work that way. So the 450 covers the bond, and I think, and I'm going to pull it up here, I believe there's zero going into, and I should be able to tell on the 6505 here really quickly. Yeah, we're transferring nothing in next year to the capital improvement. So that 450 is strictly what goes back to bond repayment.
Okay.
And that 462 is probably actually representative where it probably covers whatever split she's doing plus the singular movement into the improvement funds of last year, because that would have been was $308,000, so probably 308, and then we're probably splitting that out is where this other 160-ish thousand came into, is probably from the Boney split that she has out there, would be my guess.
Okay.
And that makes sense because somewhere in here I noticed that there was either principal and no interest payment or interest and no principal,
Yeah.
so it probably just hasn't been.
Yeah, it hasn't been.
Okay.
So it needs to be that needs to be reconciled then, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and that's why.
That makes sense.
And we
Yeah.
usually
Okay.
do that November-ish in the
Yeah.
fall as we come around to the close. We hit some of these accounts that just do auto, because most of these are done, most of our payments are a direct invoice. When we send it in, it's a direct payment. She does this like percentage split, so it automatically pulls out of BSA each slot, but then it has to be reconciled at the end is what we go through and do. Yeah, and that's what I have for 6501, unless there are other questions. Oh, did we get to capital?
No,
didn't
we
make
didn't
it
get to capital.
Capital is another area where there is a reduction. In these pieces, if you look at the land improvement drainage, the 6501, 0502, 502, 4331, you'll see $137,677. And let me pull that up. I got that laid out here. So this is based on projects strictly, and when we're looking at this, there is a project, it's just project driven. There was a project on this year that isn't on next year, roughly $100,000. Well, I say one project, but they all kind of move slightly. This year we have program storm sewer, which is always in there, roughly $400,000. But next year we have a CSO, long-term control plan, far north project, some money in there for the levee, and then we have funds in there we always have $100,000 roughly in there for emergency. So it's really those projects in the middle beyond the normal program projects and the emergency, everything else is project driven. So this reduction here is strictly based on projects from last year's items, which I can pull up here as well. Wait as I get this computer up where I want it to be. So we had two round barn projects in a Chester Boulevard piece in the budget for the year previously that are no longer there, so it's just a change in those projects. Other equipment is a reduced piece. And I believe I have a note in here that says it's a vehicle. This year, we purchased a vehicle that had a split to it, and there is not a vehicle in next year's budget. So that's the reduction in that line. So it's just equipment, actual specific reduction. And that is all I have for 6501 unless there are questions. But overall, that budget is fairly balanced. There is a surplus of $59,903 as it came out. We left it there. We could have probably tucked that into the improvement funds, but we just left it to go to the cash reserve, and we'll deal with it next year as that one balances out and shift those funds there. We can move to 6505, which is the Stormwater's Capital Improvement Fund. As we stated, there's nothing planned to go into this from the other fund coming out of it. However, we do have $687,000 planned to come out, and that project is, get to it. Is part of our biosolids piece. We're still working through the details on that. We've discussed a few times of the changes we would like to make to the biosolids program to move away from land application to an extent. And these funds were in there and that they can be utilized for that project. So we've earmarked those in case we do get into a biosolids project. We're not sure we'll be ready yet. But it's in preparation in case we can make movements towards that. And it's the whole 687.
And that's coming from stormwater?
Yeah, we earmarked a part of that piece, so we've discussed on some pieces, and we're not far enough really along in the high rate treatment, but if we do some of the changes we're looking at in the biosolids, it frees up the digester tanks to be used as other tanks, and we've looked briefly at using them as storage on the front end to be able to handle the high rate treatment piece. Now, I don't know if it'll turn out that we require it that way, but that's how we pulled a split then from the stormwater. And you'll see a larger chunk coming from, a greater chunk for the same thing coming in 6201's capital improvement funds. Yeah, I think it was like $2.5 million in 6201's capital improvement for the same piece. That's all I have for 6505, unless there are questions. 6201 next, Jess, I think. Oh, you're fine. Okay. 6201. We are showing here a 14% increase in revenue. The rates that we have laid out are not 14%, they are 5.25. I want to make a note in here, I tucked in the budget when we started building the budget in May, just because I was not sure. As you know, we've been working on the Midwest Industrial Park's sewer expansion. Mm-hmm. We know that the goal would be to try to bid that project next year to hold the timeline of some of the industries that are going out there. I don't know how it will ultimately go. I put in here when we get down to the 3,000 accounts, I'm assuming that the project would get bid, and I'm assuming what that bond repayment would be. And then I went ahead, if they chose to do that paying back strictly through our fees, there would be a rate increase associated with that. So I increased the revenue to directly offset 100% what I think that bond repayment would be. Now, that bond repayment may not actually occur if we start the construction, may not actually occur next year either, right? It could fall into 2026 depending on how that goes, but just to have it in the budget, I put these two things. But there is the direct increase on top of our 5.25% that's built into the rate. There is an additional chunk to that that I placed in here to directly offset that if that was the chosen avenue of repayment, just so that the budget would directly reflect that in the balance at the end.
Which year of the rate increase are we going to be in 2025?
2025 will be the third year of the existing rate increase, the final year of that, the last one that was done. And again, if they choose to use sewer fees as the payment method, an increase would have to be done to the rate so that we don't, as we discussed when we did the rates last time, we have to maintain that 160% roughly bond capacity so that we're in a good place, and we keep a minimum of a 6-month cash balance so that we could pay off operating expenses if something went crazy for that. And if you remember when we did, I know we're going on 2.5 years ago, but we have years where we're buying, that cash was getting bought down and the rate was catching that fall and curbing it at that 6-month cash balance and that 160% bonding fund. And you will see that this budget is spending down $3 million, but that was in the projected rates for the 3-year that we did. We were expected to buy down. That wasn't $3 million directly in this year. We talked a little last year of some things that didn't get spent that got pushed to this year. It should have been a little last year and a little this year. It turned out to be like, I say last year, I'm talking about 24 because I'm thinking about something, but that we aren't spending that gets rolled into 2025's budget. So this year is virtually a no dip, and then next year is a bigger dip is what it comes. But they both, all the projects lined up and the costs are still lining up with the rates that we laid out and the cash that was going to be bought down by, because we have that 5-year capital and the projects laid out. We actually have roughly a 10-year capital on these big pieces, but those are identified. So they get pushed or pulled, but all the projects in here were included in the rate that we put in last year, and we were expected, or not last year, 2 years ago, and that was expected to fall off this. So it's a $3 million decrease in the cash balance, but it's still balanced in the sense that it falls in line with how the rates were done and was supposed to catch that. Personal services, there is a 6.1% increase. This primarily drives from the same discussions we've had on personal services the whole time. There is, I do want to state in this one though, however, one new position being added. There is a Jeff Lowmiller sitting right here, the assistant director. He has also always been the maintenance manager. And we feel it's time to separate out that section of those duties. I hate to say it, Jeff's talked about he can see retirement somewhere in the future. I'm trying to make him push that as far as he can, but it would be unlikely that we could ever replace the assistant director who also had the knowledge to, from off-site, be able to manage 2 other maintenance departments in the plant, have that knowledge to be able to do that. So we wanted to proactively get that position in and hopefully be able to pass Jeff's knowledge off on that well before he leaves, and to fill that gap then that we think will exist. So there is one new position, but the primary driver is what we've discussed here is the 4% for civilians, the AFSCME movement, and then the insurance movements. Next is supplies. 6201 is probably the more complicated budget in the fact that it has 4 sub-departments. We have 0504, which is sewer maintenance, 0505, which is administration, 0507, which is the treatment plant, and 0508, which is the laboratory. Overall, in all the 2,000 accounts, we are going up an approximate 2.1% increase to that, which comes out to about $10,000 increase in that overall 494,000. It's about a 10,000 increase from last year. And I will go through those significant movements through here. Like I said, it creates a little bit of a bounce around because of the 4 departments. There is in the general supplies line, the 6201, 0504, 202, 2410. There is a $350 increase to that line. It's really tracking the expenses we think we're gonna, I know we're not at halfway through that year. We haven't bought everything linear, but just what we've been seeing on the things we have bought and the planned buying, the increase in cost that we've seen on a few things, we increased that slightly. The next one that we will go to is my eyes are not what they used to be on these printouts here. I apologize for just a second here. Is the next general supplies, which is the 6201, 0505, 2410 one. This one has a $2,215 increase. This is the other section on those AFSCME labor units T-shirts. This is a split on those costs. And most of that 2,215, 2,000 of that is the other section. To buy all the employees those shirts is a little under $5,000 typically. And then the other 215 is just general inflationary, roughly increases that we expected. And again, that's a case where it's not completely linearly spent. We haven't nearly spent what's budgeted in there this year, but things like these T-shirts and things like that, they haven't been purchased yet. There's several big items that we know, we looked at that and they get purchased kind of in the fall, and so we expect to use most of that. That was budgeted this year, and that's why we added that section. The next major item comes down to chemicals, 6201, 0507, 202, 2241. There's a $3,000 increase to that. As you all remember, this line overall is greatly reduced from what it used to be multiple years ago. We do not buy aluminum bisulfate anymore. We used to spend roughly $200,000 on that per year. That has went away completely. However, our disinfection chemicals, our chlorine and our sulfur dioxide, went up approximately 700% combined since COVID under force majeure lines. And we've rebid it even though we have the options to renew, we've rebid that every year, hoping to get that's gone away, but it has not. It's still held around 700%. And we've done really good at being very efficient with the use of that. So we didn't increase the budget 700%. We found ways to use less and treat better upstream. We put in a different regulator on it to kind of, it alarms us differently, and we have the ability to run that a little cleaner. When we had to move it up probably 550%. But just with what we've seen and trying to track that, we felt $3,000 was just more prudent to where we're just running so tight on it. And it's a regulated item. We don't want to get to where we have to do an amendment to a contract or anything like that if we actually need it. We just didn't want to get in that. We felt that $3,000 gave us the buffer we would expect to need. The next piece is the line directly below that. It is another 2410 general supplies line. In the 0507 section here, it's a $2,000 increase. We have added, if you remember a couple years ago, we added 2 positions to the treatment plant, 2 PM operator positions, as we kind of we've done our own in-house cleaning. We got rid of that contract for contractual cleaning, and we've done that in-house. We use those funds to create positions in there, and these are preventative maintenance operators, and they go around and do preventative maintenance, right? So with that project that we did in 2020 at the treatment plant, we added, I'd have to actually look back, but somewhere close to 30 or 40 valves that used to not exist. That gave us that control and has reduced it's given us an electrical savings of about $200,000 per year, where this now has this efficiency, but those all have to be maintained. So we've added oilers. This increase in this line is really for the oilers that they're using to maintain those actuators, this $2,000. Is that, the last line I will go to is in the 2000s of significant change is 6201, 0508, 202, 2240, supplies laboratory. This is increased by $2,750. This is directly based to just the increased costs of laboratory supplies over the last 4 years. And this is something we buy, it's laid out, we do buy it fairly linearly. They order per month and they run essentially the same test every month. I mean, we can have some weird thing come up or some anomaly that we have to do extraneous testing, but I would say 80 to 90% of the labs day to day is the same test over and over. So these supplies are bought pretty linearly, and we're tracking to maybe be slightly over what was budgeted last year. So the goal was to just build the budget for next year based on what we were seeing monthly on this year's spending. With that, we'll move into the 3000s, the other services and charges. Overall, there is a 23% increase, which is approximately $2 million of increase to this set. This covers, though, like I stated, that 1.9, I think, million, I'll pull up the exact note, but roughly 1.9 million is for that Midwest Industrial Park sewer expansion bond. If it came, that is roughly what we expect that to come out as. So really, there are some movements here up and down, but the primary driver of this entire increase is that expected bond that would be coming out. So we will go down through the 3000s here at significant changes. The first of those being 6201, 0505, 301, 3120. This is an increase of $49,000. 40,000 of this is that same exact thing we talked about in 6601 of the ACH credit card payment. I said we had 66% in 6201, but it was in two separate accounts. This moves the whole 50% of it in 6201 to one account. So it's really, we'll see a decrease further down and we'll get there, but it's in the 6201, 0507, 3120. You'll actually see a $120,000 decrease in that count, and part of that is that 40,000, or really it's 80,000, 40 going to 6601 and 40 moving up to this 6201, 0505 account. So that's the primary driver there. The next account is...
Just so anyone who's watching doesn't think that we're spending a lot on credit cards, this is our cost for people who make credit card payments. Is that correct?
Yes, it is that, and it is the third-party company that does the security piece to that aspect. Yeah, we're not, it's not credit card expenditures. It is the credit card service that we supply for payment for customers. Yes, and it's it's the cost we pay to have that service and that security for that service. Yeah, no, yeah, that would be nice to have that on the credit card. No, but that's not the next account is 6201, 0505, 302, 3210, telephone and facsimile. The largest portion of this, and you would have seen that as we started this year, as you know, we're working on asset management and that software implementation. We purchased, and I don't know the number off the top of my head, of the tablets that are to be used with that, and it's related to the data plan. Most of this increases that data plan. There is also an increase here, as we know we are going to have the new office building. There's going to be another at least machine there that will be doing this. So those two things combined are that $8,600 increase in that line item. As we go down there in the 0505 line, there's the workman's comp and the liability insurance. I'm not going to speak much on that. That's really the same thing we've talked about in the other lines. or the other accounts. But we'll go further down to 6201, 0505, 305, 3510. Electric facilities, this has a $1,000 increase. We put this in for that new building. That's what we expected that increase to be for that facility. And I do want to say there are increases for the new building. We factored that in when we purchased the building, still as we looked at square footage of building onto our current build, all the things. We did factor in all these regular O&M expenses as we purchased that, and we still felt that was the better move. The next line I will go to here is lease payment, 6201, 0505, 312, 3815. There's a $5,000 increase. As you know, this year we did a lease on a new vac truck, and that is reflective of that change of that lease versus the one that would have landed in this year and previous years. The next line of significant increase is 6201, 0505, 312, 3974. This has an increase of $1.713936 million. That is that sewer Midwest Industrial Park sewer expansion bond. That is roughly what we've calculated on, really rough estimates on what that project would cost. And obviously, we don't know exactly which interest rate we are going to get, right? So this is an estimate. It's kind of a conservative estimate for that. But I did want to place that into the budget. The next item, if you go down to 6201, 0507, 301, 3120, professional services. We kind of talked about this briefly a minute ago, where there's a $120,000 reduction. 80,000 of that roughly is that credit card ACH payment that we've talked about. So 80 of that came out, 40 went up top in 0505 here, and 40,000 went to the 6601 to have an actual 50% or 50-50 split. We also reduced, where we talked about grant consultant reduction in 6501, there's a grant consultant reduction here as well. So that's what's driving that $120,000 reduction here. The line right below that, 6201, 0507, 301, 3180, is land application of biosolids. There is a $300,000 increase on that. There's a long history here of land application and biosolids and those costs. The costs have gone up for land application itself. The pounds of solids in the plant have increased. We talked about that. That's why we put that rotary drum project in 2019. It thickened it up, but still, as those costs have increased and pounds have increased, we were able to handle them, and we're not doing these emergency applications, but we do expect that there's a potential for this to go up into next year. We also, as we're looking at changing this process, we had some funds. Part of this 300 is built in case we change processes, to make sure we can have that, because there's several things that go into this capital-wise if we chose to change our process. So the capital would change. So we were preparing for that with this $300,000 increase. The next line is directly below that, 6201, 0507, 301, 3990. There's a $22,000 increase. This comes from several of our notes. So our Centos, which is clothing, our elevator service that we have, our elevators have to be safety inspected per year. Safety Tech, which does our fire and security alarming, as well as they will be doing it at the new facility that we have. So all these little things, there were several of our contracts that went up independently that totaled 12% increase, which comes out to this $22,000 increase in that line. The next significant one is down in 6201, 0508, 301, 3990. This is the laboratory's contractual service. The contracted lab So I'll talk a little bit about this. The lab that we use to do our contract samples, so there are certain tests that we do not run in-house, such as metals. The equipment for metals testing costs $60,000 alone, and we don't run enough samples to justify that. So these are reasons why we use contract lab for certain pieces. One, that contract has went up. We know that it has, so there is that cost. What we've normally done, though, is we don't actually budget the max that the contract that we have, we don't budget our max expenditure, because we normally do not spend, that max is based upon every test we think we could ever have to run. We did have to increase it last year based upon the My Way fire incident. We did do a lot more sampling on that. But the overall contract has went up, but the other piece to this is we are on a list of EPA's top 200 plants. I can't remember the list, but that is going to require PFAS testing, and we've talked a little bit about PFAS. There's some required sampling that we know is coming into that. Those tests right now, there are not very many accredited labs, and it is $500 per sample. We really have 3 sites that we have to do internally: Headworks, so the influent to the plant, the effluent to the plant, and our biosolids. But what it's looking like we may have to do is also set this up for all of our industrial users, so we could identify areas of incoming PFAS. So based upon that loading of those samples that we may have to do for that expensive new regulatory test, the slight increase in the contract cost for normal test and for what we know we might have to do if we have to do those PFAS tests, because we are on EPA's list of facilities that will have to do them. They haven't mapped out exactly timelines for that or how many you have to do per year, so we're assuming the worst, and we built that into this. So that is what's driving that $13,900 increase in this line. And that is all I have as far as significant changes go to the 3,000s here. It is quite a bit, but the main driving factor in that is that Midwest Industrial Park potential expansion bond piece. Next, we will move on to our capital lines. Overall, there is a 69% increase to this, roughly $2.5 million. These are project specific, and I can pull up these projects specifically to show it. But the one that's really increasing the whole line is in 6201, 0505, 502, 4321. That has roughly the $2 million increase. Let me pull up that list of those projects here. Yeah, so we have some of our typical pieces in here. We have some stuff for the emergency, kind of like we talked about in 6501. There's some emergency sewer, 100,000 that's always placed in there. There is our sanitary sewer rehabilitation and risk management. Those funds are in there every year. There's our programmed sanitary sewer projects. This went up to some degree because this was something that was usually split 50-50 to 6601, and I discussed came back to 100% in this fund. But the big items are biosolids facility, which we discussed, has over $1 million, or has $1 million exactly coming out of the actual capital fund here. There's more in the improvement fund as well. But there's $1 million here. We have that high rate treatment, which is the last project really for the long-term control plan. We have $1 million out on that for the design work. And the last one is another long-term control plan project, which is our Chester Boulevard Interceptor Phase 3 design. And there is 1.1 million, sorry, I was trying to get my eyes. There's 1.1 million there. So there are 3 really significant projects. Again, 2 of those where have been laid out for a long time in the long-term control plan. The biosolids is something we've discussed for multiple years as well. We've been working towards that as well. So there is those three pieces, and that is essentially what's making the capital look different here. Everything else has slight movements, but of the $2.5 rough million that increase, you're looking at I think 2 million specifically, and this like 2.1 million is strictly these three projects and the way things have moved there.
And the 1 million for the high rate piece is just still planning and contracting for it? Because
Correct,
that
it is
piece
just-
is-
Is expensive. I
Very
mean, so if you look at our 5-year capital, and we've been working on projected costs, right? This is going to exceed probably $40 million on the project. So if you think of design cost as somewhere between 10 and 20%, these are just working towards. We've spent some funds already on design, we've got some preliminary work done. But we just recently got some modeling data from Commonwealth. We've had 2 significant storms this year that we were able to calibrate and verify models. The good news is that flow is on the lower end of what we anticipated, and it should work with the plan we had of being able to make modifications to our existing tertiary building structure without having to build a separate structure and/or put storage in or things inside the storm sewers themselves, in-stream modifications, which would have driven that cost up further. So the modeling data did give us our kind of best case scenario piece, so we were excited about that. But now that we have that, we can move forward with design, now that we have a hard number of what we know we are going to have to treat. So that's why the funds are coming out now. And part of that was waiting on rain events to collect that data that we felt strong enough to make a stand on which route to go there. That is a driving factor of that. Again, overall, this budget is taking a $3,428,152.82 dip into its cash, but again, that was projected with our rates. That still lands us within our bonding capacity and our 6-month cash balance. So this is what we expected at some point in time. That is all I have on 6201, unless there are questions. If not, we can move to 6207, which is the Capital Improvement Fund. For the 6201 account. All right, so we have being transferred into this fund $1,091,936. That is for several different assets. We have some just general treatment plant asset management, but we have some specific, there's $256,000 going in for treatment plant asset replacement, and that's based on just a formula. There's $100,000 rectangular, or we have a rectangular drives. So we have rectangular primaries. Their drive units we know are kind of beyond their useful life. So we have $100,000 going back in as partially to go towards when those get replaced. We have $700,000 for a sewer expansion. One of the things we've talked about as we've done that Midwest Industrial Park piece is we've never had money set aside for expansion. That always comes with whole new rates. Tentatively, what we believe would happen if they did it through all sewer use rates, the Midwest Industrial Park is actually, to do the full expansion, is 3 sections. The first phase would be 2 of those sections. There is a third section that is approximately $10 million, $11 million, something of that ballpark. If we were going to raise the rate, to me, if they want to pay for it out of sewer use fees or whatever mechanism is there, it would make sense to do it to a level that you could put enough money back that roughly when we kind of are expecting that third section to have to be done, you would have the funds to pay for it instead of bond it. So the $700,000 is what that would roughly look like. So if that came through there, we would go ahead and immediately earmark that $700,000 roughly per year goes back to these improvement funds to be able to do that third section to that Midwest Industrial Park. Again, this completely will fall to city council. The sanitary district doesn't do expansions and we don't build industrial parks, right? This is going to be at the pleasure if city council wants to, what level they want to market that at and all these pieces, right? We were charged with coming up with the infrastructure that could serve that, and that's what we will present. If they choose to build that, here are the costs of it, and here is where you would need to do these 3 sections, and these are our pieces, but ultimately it will be decided. So if it does not get picked, these numbers would fall off of our budget. I would come in and make a recommendation. There's such large values, I would come make recommendations to reduce budgets if these were not going to occur next year. So that is the 1 million, slightly over $1 million that are going in. Coming out, we have $3,552,650 that we plan to take out, and this is based around several projects. There's $520,000 that is coming out for our return activated sludge pumps. There is money in the normal capital. We didn't go through every single note on those, but one of the capital items in 6201, there's some funds there also for these return activated sludge pumps. That would be approximately a $1 million project. So there are 4 large pumps in the down low in the plant that take the mixed liquor that's settled in our final clarifiers and pumps them back up the hill, but they're getting close to the end of their life. We don't know that it'll come into next year. There's some talks about could it wait and go into the high rate treatment project, but they're absolute critical pieces. If they should have failed, the plant will completely fail. Like there's not, so we're really evaluating that, but we want to plan for that in the budget in case we want to get that out. There is $420,150 for the levy. We've discussed that is that other 50% that we had in the improvement funds for the last 3 or 4 years. But as we are looking and feel good about the potential of the Okra grant, we have went ahead and budgeted this so that we could do that levy work around the treatment plant. There is $2,052,500 set back for biosolids. So this is the other section to that biosolids. So there's roughly $3 million coming out of 6201, and then there was that 600,000 or so out of stormwater, and some of that depends on through projects if what we think we would utilize, how we go with the biosolids, and if it's a method that leaves some of that tankage as real estate that we can use for other things, it could serve for our stormwater. So it'll kind of depend on what path ultimately is taken there. And then there's $500,000 in here for the high rate treatment design. So as well as the $1 million that was coming out in the regular capital, there is another $500,000 that had been set up. There's actually quite a bit more than $500,000 in the improvement funds here set aside for high rate treatment overall, but 500 is what we think. So the ones all the lines together, we think is what it would cost us to get into an agreement for the design work for that high rate treatment facility for next year. And that sums up that total $3,552,650 of planned expenditures. And this does buy down cash out of this as well, so that takes us, we're reducing to the overall balance in this improvement fund by $2.46 million, but there'll still be $4.6 million in these capital improvement funds. And again, these are all, as they go back in there, as I read off what was going in, they're earmarked for what projects they go in for, and they're pulled out for those earmarked projects. And that is all I have on 6207, unless there are additional questions. Hearing none, we will move to the easiest fund in the whole thing, 6202. 6202 is our bond fund. It is a net zero movement. It is just where we talked about funds coming out of the 6201 and the 6505. They transfer into this account, and then this account pays out to the actual fund. So it's what goes into here is virtually exactly what goes out of this account. There is some interest and things like that come onto it, but essentially it's just a pass-through account, not an actual anything else going on there. If there are no questions on that, we will move to our final fund, which is the landfill, the 2221. In the landfill funds, we are seeing in the revenue, we are projecting a little under 5% growth. There's a couple percent of that is built upon the rate. So we talked about the sewer rate. The landfill rate was done at the same time and goes through the same year, so there's a 2% added to this. Talking with the controller, Tracy McGinnis, we also increased the interest that we get, the earnings and investments on this. Typically, we've been doing $1,500, but we've actually been seeing more of that in that breakout. So she adjusted it to basically what she's seeing coming in. So that went from $1,500 to $50,000. So there's a good chunk of that. If you go down to the very last piece of revenue, miscellaneous receipts, that went from $980 to $990. This is primarily a reflection of where we talked before of that transfer that the trash department pays to the landfill for the trash it takes out there. And from that growth and that money we added there, that is where that extra 10,000 comes into these miscellaneous. There's some other miscellaneous that are really, really small amounts, but the 10,000 is directly reflective of the change we made in 6601. Personal services, there's a 2.6% increase. This follows the exact same things we've discussed before. In the supplies accounts, there is a 4.3% increase, which is approximately $6,000 to the roughly $170,000 that are normal spent, and I will go over what those are. The first significant change in the 2000 accounts is in the asphalt account, which is 2221, 0503, 202, 2364. We have 50,000 in there this year. Next year, we're proposing 37,500, which is a $12,500 reduction. You'll notice we haven't spent any of that 50,000 yet. We usually utilize street department, and we're kind of the end of the year thing, so we'll spend that. But we usually have sections identified that need pavement, so this is based strictly on what we believe next year's requirement would be. If we go down to general supplies, the 2221, 0503, 202, 2410, there's an increase there of $5,950. The split for those shirts I spoke about earlier is a 40-40-20, so 20% is coming to there, so there's a factor of that increase in this. There is also this 0503 account also covers all of our administration splits, but there is an increase here for cleaning supplies and all that would go into the new building. So that 20% split of those increases on that hits this. And then the landfill itself saw some increase in cost of general supplies, which you've noticed as we went through. General supplies as a line we've talked about an increase as we go down. Just the expenditures of all those have slightly gone up. So, and then we add the new building and me allotting a specific note for the shirts accounts for this, the increase there. The next line is 2221, 0503, 202, 2418, safety supplies. There's a $4,300 increase to that. That directly relates to the AED batteries come around on like a 5-year cycle that have to be replaced, and they are $5,000. So almost all, there's actually an overall reduction of normal supplies, but because those AED batteries are coming around on their 5-year cycle, that is the entire increase to that line. The last line in the 2000s to talk about is 2221, 0503, 203, 2322, repair parts and equipment. We are showing a $6,500 increase. Parts have just went up, kind of like the general supplies. And this is something that is pretty similar to when I talked about the laboratory supplies, that they spend it pretty linearly, and you can see we're tracking to spend more this year than we have budgeted. What we'll probably do is we'll just hold off that last month or so. We probably will not appropriate money. We'll just roll into the next year. But this is hopefully enough to cover that roll in, as well as maybe what we're seeing as increases. So this goal is for that. With that, we can move to the 3000 accounts, the other services and charges. There is overall a 29% increase to these, which equates to about a $350,000 increase in expenditures. I'll go through the significance there. The first of these is 2221-0108, 312-3987. It is the pilot program. As you are aware, that pilot is payment in lieu of taxes, which the landfill pays back to the city. Last year, if you remember, we reevaluated the LEAF program and what we paid to LEAFs, and that interlocal was updated. Crone, O.W. Crone, who did both these originally, also did the pilot. At that time, the mayor and controller felt that the $17,367 increase was not something they wanted to approach from a standpoint of it was late in the budget season to get the interlocal done. They left it off. The mayor now, and I would have expected, regardless how that went, we would have done it this year. But that is what they did. They took the O.W. Crone data from last year that was done, and they applied it, and I have drafted that. Law does have that document. I would expect to come to this board at some point in time and get that interlocal approved. If it is approved, though, this is what that increase would be to that pilot list, that $17,367. And that is based on depreciated value of the assets at the landfill. The next line with increase is 2221, 0503, 301, 3120. Professional services, there is an $81,540 increase. This really has two things that are really driving that increase. One, we want to come back around and reevaluate the landfill gas and how that can be used. There are several new technologies out there and a lot of programs, especially that have government like funding backing them, so it makes them really it makes the private industry much more willing to look at smaller size landfills, and they're reaching out. The hard part for us is there's so many different technologies. How do we, as a city, we don't often sell a product. So how do we, apples to apples, bid that, if you will, when the tech, if it was one technology, it's fairly easy. But since there's so many different technologies and so many things, we are going to be using Andrews Engineering, who is our engineering firm that looks at all of our landfill projects. They have experience in this, and they're going to help us develop a spec so that we can accurately weigh and be safeguarded, because we don't want to get into where we're selling gas and companies want us to do things that don't meet our regulatory side so that we can increase gas, right? We want to do our regulation and sell what gas happens to be there for the excess. We don't want to get into we're chasing gas at the expense of regulatory pieces. And we just wanted some more expertise on that. There's some surveying pieces that are required at the landfill as well, but those are the primary two factors of the development of those two items that are driving that $81,540 increase. The good piece is that landfill gas spec and all that evaluation and helping us bid that project and looking over those concerns would be a one-time cost. This is not a permanent increase to professional services. This would be just to look through that.
And with the hopes of generating some revenue on our end.
Yeah, because Elijah and I have spoke to multiple different of these technologies. They're all roughly talking like a $200,000-ish ballpark rebate to us based on what they currently see on our gas and last time it was analyzed. So we do hope that we could get into a situation where that we feel protected enough to enter into one of these agreements and to get that rebate back of that $200,000 is our goal. It's too big of an opportunity for us not to throw a little money at the looking at those specs and that bidding process. The next line we have the workman's comp, property liability insurance, and property liability claims. Again, we've talked about that. HR's, how they calculated those values. And those are really the driving significant movements in the 3,000 accounts. I'll move on to the capital lines. There is a 100% increase in this of the 800, hang on, let me back up on the 3,000 accounts here. I did not realize I had a couple on the next page here. One of those, back to the 3000s, 2221, 0503, 312, 3941, state fees. The state, we pay the Indiana Department of Environmental Management fees both for the tonnage we receive. We pay them fees for our, for the tires. We pay like waste gas. I mean, we pay the state several fees. We got a note this year in February or March where the state increased their fees. This year, we did a transfer of some other funds to cover that, but next year we are budgeting appropriately to be able to pay the state's increase in fees. And then the other item is the transfer funds right below that, the 3974 account. This account is where the landfill pays our wastewater treatment plant for the leachate they send. If you remember the discussion this year we had earlier this year with the new open cell, the leachate is increased. It's just a broad open cell, so it's collecting more rain. So this is hopefully to plan for that, but that should continue to decrease back down as that cell gets, the bottom layer gets put in, and we would expect it to go back to its normal rate. So, but that is the increase there. With that, I will move on to capital expenditures. There's nearly 100% increase in this, approximately a $700,000 increase to this. The number one piece to this is there's a single item in the capital. It is a D8 bulldozer. The replacement cost we expect to be $610,000. Again, we don't buy these every year, but that is when this cycle comes up, it is a large factor. I do want to say, however, that the line in 2221, 0503, 503, 4310, other structures, there is $798,000 in that. If you look at this year's budget, you'll see $700,000 in that. That is that other piece I was talking about for capping a landfill cell. We don't expect to spend that $700 this year. So really, that really offsets the dozer for next year because we're not spending $700,000 this year and it rolls in. It does balance that, even though the budget shows a dip in cash. There's $700,000. This year's entire capital is $773,000. 700 of that is not going to be spent, is for closing a cell. So that does roll over and offset that large increase that we are showing in the projected 2025 budget. So this budget overall has a decrease in cash of $970,000. However, as we discussed, $700,000 is not getting spent in this year. So it does have a $270,000. Which again, as we looked at long-term in this, we kind of expected some dip in that cash when we did the rate because of these. We get dips and then slight years where we go up, and that's really due to when we have to purchase these big bulldozers that are, that $600,000 is after our trade-in value. A bulldozer is just under $1 million. So when those come around, they hit the budget a little harder than the years where they're not there. That's all I have in 2221. I can move to its improvement fund if there are no questions. $4650, the landfill capital improvement fund. Yes. So we show $200,000 going into this fund. That $200,000 is earmarked for a transfer station. We've been putting back for this a couple years now. So our goal would ultimately be, if you've been to the landfill, we have the Resource Recovery Center, so people can dump into those tubs that are kind of recessed into the ground. But our trash trucks have to drive up on the hill itself, and then there's some things where the public drives up on the hill as well. But our trash trucks are not, they're road trucks, not off-road trucks, and it does put a lot of wear and tear on them, and it is significant costs. The ultimate goal we would like to do is build a transfer station, which kind of would replace that resource recovery. Or it would duplicate it, but it would be a housed, much larger structure so that our trash trucks could dump in that. It will be paved. They don't go on the hill anymore. It'll also keep a lot of the public off of the landfill face itself. We also believe that if we build this, we would move our recycling facility that's currently at the wastewater treatment plant facility. We would move that out there as well. It makes more sense logistically, we believe. We also believe that we are going to grow landfill diversion strategies, including diverting some construction and demolition waste. And again, any of that diversion would have to be housed before we would be shipping that off to some facility, but it would have to be under roof, let's put it that way. So for those three factors, we believe that ultimately building a transfer station out there would aid us. So we've been putting money back towards that every year. We also, as we apply for these several grants that we do for recycling, that looks at some of that equipment and overall the effects of what would be in this transfer station. So we're trying to buy down that cost. We know it would be expensive. In the end, we have toured several facilities. We believe it's going to fall somewhere between $3 and $5 million to build this facility. But we do think it ultimately pays for itself in several factors. Plus, we would keep that structure. We're kind of getting tight on several places of space at the treatment plant. And we know we can use that large building then to move some of those structures over there where it makes sense to move it's all at the treatment plant, we can utilize that space. So in the end, it saves us from having to build on there and building on here, we get these added benefits. So that's a piece that goes back to that $200,000. We show $380,000 coming out of the improvement fund. You also see in this year, we show $380,000 coming back. That is also for that capping of a landfill cell. So we are not spending that this year. We look to spend it next year. So it's really, we're adding $200,000 to it, but the cash balance should just go up $200,000, reflective of the unspent $380,000 for this year. And that is all I have, unless there are questions on this improvement fund. That overall wraps up my presentation of the budget. As those variables come out in 6601 with the code enforcement piece, I will bring that to the board. If there are no other suggestions on the ones that, again, that 6601 goes to city council ultimately, and it's not a part of our resolutions. But if there are any changes made to the ones that will go in the resolution, we will discuss those at the resolution time. But the 6601 will probably be as it will go on to the other side, I will bring, though, an update of whatever that cash balance looks like with the updated interlocals and those pieces. So I will bring those back to the board for comment at that time.
No, as always, a great job, and it's always good to see how much we can do with our own funds of the different projects, that we can keep going on those projects with the rates that we have, with the funding that we have. And I think it's particularly comforting to know that you have the 5 and the 10-year capital improvements, the plans for those, that we're being able to set aside monies each year for those. It's good to see how the lease components have allowed us to do a little bit, to get the 3 trucks instead of the 1 at one time. So, I mean, I think it's great. I like seeing that we're continuing to work on the biosolids piece, because that's been a lot of money over the years. So it's good to see that happening. And I know the MRF project, you've talked about that before, of moving that out. So it's just, a lot of projects, and it just costs a lot of money to do it all.
It does cost a lot of money to do.
And it's just that long-term control plan, and knowing that the high rate was at the end of the tunnel out there, and the cost that it was going to be is just something that I've no doubt has always been in the back of everybody's the dreaded, looking at that at the end of the road.
Very much so. We were very ecstatic to get the values we had and know that we were going to get the best case scenario. It was kind of scary to think of
Actually
what it.
slightly better than best case. Though.
Yeah, slightly better.
On our radar, so,
Yeah,
yeah, definitely.
yeah, because you've been watching the rain, I know, for several years. There's not been enough rain.
I think that we're already here and talking about high rate treatment though. I mean,
Yeah.
It seems
Yeah.
like forever ago that we started the process and doing projects and, planning for this. And so it's good to see, I guess, the fruits of all we've done in the past to get this point where some little things, one thing that pops in my mind is a decision that we all made to increase the size of East Side Interceptor Phase 2, or Phase 3, from 48-inch to 54-inch. And that decision cost us about $500,000, but in looking at it, probably saved us $20 million, because we can get that flow to the treatment plant now, where we wouldn't have. And we didn't know that that was exactly what would happen. But it was one of those things that worked out for us and the
Right.
community as a whole. So yeah, those are exciting things to look back.
Yeah, yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, fully second that. Yeah, when we were looking at what worst case scenario would have been, easy $20 million. And that was a huge component of driving this down, was that $500,000 investment that they made. So we were pretty happy after that day. I wish I could have left after. I was so happy. I was like, man, can we just go home today? But we still had several hours to go after that.
Yeah. Well, and the same as you mentioned with bringing that preventive maintenance in-house, because we've had, over the years, several times where we've had that, emergency, a 20-year-old valve or something that we can't. So to be on top of that, just save the savings in the long run on those things.
Yeah, and I think the asset management we're working at will just continually improve those efforts. Will help us have data and better focus our efforts with our limited personnel that we have. So we can hopefully go farther on that with that
Right.
asset management.
Well, and I think when you see the successes, you see that you have made the right choice, that I know things you've probably sort of struggled with, like, do we need a new building? Can we
Yes.
make it do down here? Then I think it gives you a little more confidence to say, no, this is the right way to go with it.
Correct.
Trust your instincts on it. Any other questions, comments? So I take it, we basically have concluded the agenda for today. And then the budget is brought back to the board at some later date for,
Correct. We'll bring it back as a resolution. I will probably wait. So some of that salary interlocal I've discussed is split across a few funds. So depending on how that comes out and how that gets finalized, it could impact 6201, and maybe even potentially 2221. I think it'll be small, and it won't affect the overall what we're looking at, but I would like to bring those back before I bring them as a resolution, likely, just to make sure before we draft to that. But the goal will be, I would guess, either last meeting in September or first meeting in October, I would like to have the resolution come before here. And again, that comes with public hearing, so obviously we have to get the timing. I have to have it all done with the timing to do the advertisement and all that to get to the public hearing piece. But the goal will be one of those two meetings. I would expect the resolution to come back. And if there isn't a decision made by that point in time on the interlocals, we may have to do a change or appropriation to the budget next year sometime if that comes to fruition after that. But I'll try to hold out as long as I can to do it the first time. It's easier that way, so.
yeah. Okay. So hearing that there's no more business to be brought before the board today, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
And I will second the motion. There's a motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? We are adjourned.